Um, Thanks for coming to our Bigleaf maple syrup webinar. Before we start, we're just going to go over a couple Zoom things. Just to make sure that when you enter something into the chat, it goes to everyone rather than just hosts and panelists, which is the default, just so everybody can see each other's questions and comments. And as questions arise, just put them in the chat, and then I will relay them to Patrick at the end of his presentation. So we'll try to save 5 or 10 minutes for that. And if you are interested in more Maple events, Patrick will go into further detail at the end of his talk, but I'm just going to pop one thing in the chat so that you can check it out while you're listening. And this is going to be at Myers Point Station in Olympia, and Patrick will be hosting this, and it's going to be an in-person maple syrup workshop. And I think I forgot to mention that my name is Grace Garrison, and I'm an extension forester in the Puget Sound area. So thanks to everybody who came, and Patrick, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I should probably share my screen. All right. Does that look okay?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to turn off my video then real quick. Yeah, good evening, everybody. I hope you're all bearing the heat well. Seems like a strange time to talk about big leaf maple sugaring when it's almost 100 degrees. But this is a good opportunity to get prepared for the next season, which will start in November, December. So didn't even introduce myself. I'm Patrick Schultz. I'm an extension forester with WSU in Southwest Washington. I'm based out of Olympia at the Myers Point Field Station that Grace just mentioned. And I've been involved with some maple syrup research, some grant projects that are looking into whether or not this is a viable practice in Washington. We know it's viable at the hobby scale, and we're looking into whether it's viable at the commercial scale, and it seems to be. So I really enjoy giving this talk. It's going to be focusing really on just the basics, definitely coming at it from more of a hobby perspective, kind of just getting started, which I imagine a lot of you folks would be kind of doing this for the first time. And then, as Grace mentioned, there will be opportunity to kind of learn a little bit more in depth at those workshops, and then plenty of opportunities beyond that as well. And I'll touch a little bit on like what it might take to get into commercial scale, but we really won't be focusing a lot on that today. All right, let me see if I can get my slide to switch here. So we're going to start by covering sap flow, the mechanism behind it. Then we'll talk tapping, timing of tapping, tools, materials, that kind of thing. Get into sap collection systems, the different ways that you can collect the sap. Processing, which is basically boiling. That's how you go from sap to syrup. Products and storage. We'll touch a little bit on Sugarbush management, how you manage fruit trees for better sap production. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the programs coming out beyond even the workshops that we've discussed. So how does maple sap flow work? Not a lot of people know the mechanics behind it. A lot of people don't understand that it requires cold temperatures, so that really is the key. Basically, what we're waiting for is freezing temperatures followed by warm temperatures or thawing temperatures. So that freeze-thaw cycle is what generates sap flow in the tree. And what's happening there is that the freezing temperatures cause a negative pressure inside the tree. And this happens in maples because they hold gas in the intercellular spaces, and the gas contracts. And when it contracts, it creates that negative pressure that sucks water up from the roots into the xylem or the sapwood, and then into the upper part of the tree. In that process, that water collects or dissolves sugars that are naturally stored in the tree. And that's how it becomes sugary, sweet sap that we know. So cut to the next day, you get some warm temperatures that cause the sap to thaw and then move downwards. And the higher relative pressure inside the tree pushes the sap out through a tap that we create. So this is unique to maples and a handful of other species precisely because of that gas that's held in those intercellular spaces. In other trees, there's actually liquid there, which in the case of freezing, we know liquid actually expands. So you're having the opposite effect. So there's a few other species that do this, and most of them, they're all hardwoods, and a lot of those are more native to the eastern part of the country. And but we can tap our maples for sure here. So what's sap? It's mostly water. Big leaf maple is about 98% water at least. But there's also sugar, of course, mostly in the form of sucrose. And then minerals, vitamins, and amino acids. And this is what makes, I think, maple syrup a really interesting source of sugar. There's really I don't know if you can call any form of sugar particularly healthy. I mean, everything in small doses, right? But the added minerals, vitamins, and amino acids that come with maple sugar make it slightly more healthy of an option than traditional cane sugar or corn syrup. And this is the breakdown from Eastern sugar maple sap on the right here. So we don't have this broken down for big leaf maple yet. We do believe that there's probably more mineral content in the big leaf maple sap, but we haven't confirmed that yet. The question I always get is, does taking sap hurt the tree? And the answer is technically yes. In the same way that, pruning might hurt a tree, or you're temporarily causing harm to a tree. I like to equate it to drawing blood. We get blood drawn all the time for various reasons, and it doesn't really hurt us as long as we don't take too much, right? So the same concept applies to a tree. And we have rules of sustainability around tapping that I'll get into later that really describe how much is too much that you're taking. Ultimately, what we take from a tree is really a small percentage of what is available. And they've done longitudinal studies back east that show that really, in terms of growth reduction, comparing an untapped tree and a tapped tree, you only see about a 5% reduction in growth. And that's a pretty good indicator of stress as well. So we're really not doing too much damage to the trees. All right, so the first step, if you're going to consider doing this on your own, on your property, is to find your sugar bush. Your sugar bush is a sort of folksy term for wherever your collection of maple trees is that condensed stand, or it could be spread across your whole, 5, 6, 7 acres or whatever, however many you have. But we like to call it a sugar bush because it's fun and folksy. Step here is being able to identify big leaf maple. We do have other maple species technically in Washington. We have Douglas maple, which tends to grow more in the mountains, a little bit higher elevation, not very common. And then we have, of course, have vine maple, which doesn't tend to get big enough to tap, although I have heard of some people trying this on vine maple. In urban areas, we might have other species. You might have sugar maple, red maple, sort of non-native maples. Box elder is technically a maple species that is tappable. So if you're in an urban or para-urban space, you might actually be able to tap some of those as well. But we'll be focusing mostly on big leaf maple. Relatively easy to identify. It has that traditional maple shaped leaf that we all know and love, except that it's very, very large, right? It's often 12 inches across or more. It's where it gets its namesake. The leaves are dark green on top and pale below. A key feature here, leaves and stems are arranged oppositely on the branch. So if you're identifying in the winter, which you very well could be doing this because this is done in the winter, you can look at the twig and you see that these buds will be arranged opposite of each other as opposed to alternating up and down the stem. Another native tree species that does this is Oregon ash. So it will be important to be able to discern between the two of those. Dogwood also does this, but it generally doesn't take on the same form, right? You don't see dogwoods quite as big as maples. But so that is an important feature as well that sets it apart from a lot of other trees. So the flowers in the spring are greenish yellow and they hang in clusters. They make a very good snack. Ultimately, the fruits develop into a two-winged samara, which is that helicopter seed that we all like to play with. And the bark is gray brown. It's smooth when it's young, but as it gets older in the 30, 40, 50 years old, it starts to get grooved and it takes on a shape closer or a texture like this that you see here. And in terms of habitat, it's actually pretty broad. It can grow in a lot of different areas, but it likes moist but relatively well-drained soil. So it doesn't really like to grow right in the water. You're not going to see it in a wetland, but you'll see it adjacent to it. You'll see it on stream sides and floodplain areas. You'll see it. And it doesn't tend to grow in excessively dry sites either, though. So which trees should you tap? General rule of thumb is not to tap anything less than 10 inches. We'll talk about a few possible exceptions to that later. Multi-stemmed clumped trees are really great candidates. This is a clump that is on not my property. It's the WSU property I help manage, where I have a demonstration forest. So these are really, really great tapping candidates. You can see we have multiple stems over 10 inches. Each one of those you can treat as an individual tree, even though genetically this is all the same tree. Trees to avoid: sick, dying, or stressed trees, large old growth trees. That's sort of my comment here. When I see large old growth trees, I'm talking, 40 inches plus in diameter, even bigger. When they're really just in that big monster stage, I just noticed that they really don't produce very much. Part of that could be because of the bark is so thick that you're not really getting into a lot of the sapwood when you tap. There could be a number of reasons for it, but that's been my experience and the experience of some others that I've spoken with. Trees with heart rot you want to avoid. Talk about how to figure that out in a little bit, but just avoiding getting sap from an area that's full of bacteria and fungus is really important. In terms of site, grade, or slope can be very important depending on what collection system you're using. And then water table, right, is going to be really important because those trees are sucking water up during that freeze. So it's good to have a high water table available for that. All right, so the basics of tapping. We'll start with timing. And this is a key distinction between tapping in the Pacific Northwest versus tapping east of the Mississippi, in the Northeast, the Midwest, where they do this quite a bit. So our season is longer, less condensed compared to theirs, where they might be tapping or their season might be kind of condensed to March, April. They may tap earlier, but for the most part, a lot of their sap production is happening in that transition between winter and spring, where you're getting warm temperatures during the day, but you're still getting freezing temperatures at night because they have a much harsher winter than we do. We have a very mild winter, so we're kind of sitting around waiting for the freezing temperatures because we're pretty much guaranteed to get a thawing temperature just about every day. So that can happen anytime between November and March in Washington. By the time you get to March, the trees are starting to allocate some sap to the buds, and that sap becomes kind of a buddy flavor, which is really interesting. Can taste kind of musty. So a lot of people don't tap in the last half of March. They kind of stop, even though you might still get some freezes. But anyway, is your timing and how many freezes you get is going to depend a lot on your location and elevation. Obviously, higher in the mountains, you're going to get colder temperatures. Further north, you're going to get some colder temperatures as well. Even microclimate is also important. You're in a valley, you're in a ridge top, that kind of thing. But you always want to tap right before or while the sap is flowing. You don't want to go out and just put your tap on the trees November 1st, because the tap is going to start healing almost immediately, especially if you're getting warm temperatures in the upper 40s, 50s. Those tap wounds will start healing really quickly. Bigleaf maple is pretty vigorous, and that's going to result in really low sap flow. So you want to take advantage of a freeze by getting a fresh wound right before or during that thaw after a freeze. And this requires keeping a close eye on weather predictions. I'm basically watching the weather every single day, a couple times a day between November and March. So into the mechanics of tapping, you want to use a drill bit size that matches your tap size, obviously. The standard is 5/16, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find anything that's different, frankly. But getting a 5/16 drill bit, they actually make special drill bits that are pretty good at getting all the wood shavings out so that you don't have to deal with that in your sap. And then getting 5/16 taps to match those. So you want to drill the hole straight into the tree, 2 inches deep. Some people might argue to do it at an angle, and you could do that if you're doing buckets and bags. But otherwise, if you're doing tubing or anything like that, you want to do it straight into the tree. And I could talk about that a little bit later. But while you're doing this, you want to watch for brown or rotted wood. So I have a little video here, and you can see this is from last year. I need to improve these videos. I was holding my phone in one hand and the drill in the other. It's really difficult to get leverage, so sorry for the shakiness. But you can see the wood coming out is very fresh, white, no brown or any evidence of rotting or heart rot in there. Then you want to place the tap immediately. Avoiding sort of bacteria exposure to that fresh tap wound is important. So getting the tap in there right away, tapping it in until it's secure, and there you can see some sap flow starting. So I did this the morning after a pretty good freeze. So you have different types of taps. Metal versus plastic seems to be a common argument, although it's less relevant today. Frankly, most of the time we're doing plastic. Metal is still relevant for buckets and bags, but they do make plastic taps like these that are also good for and can support buckets and bags. But you might spring for the metal because they're easier to clean and reuse. A lot of the plastic is difficult to really clean unless you're really intensive about it. If you only have 10 or 15 taps, that's pretty easy. But the metal are a little more expensive, but easier to keep clean and get rid of that bacteria. Otherwise, a lot of the plastic, if you're doing a tubing system, might be single use. I'm currently trying to see how possible it is to reuse some of these taps. Fortunately, everything's recyclable, at least. And then there's different kinds of taps even within that range. I won't get into too much detail, but for instance, this is a check valve sap. So as the sap, if you have a good sap run during the day, but then it's going to get freezing again at night, that sap can actually suck back into the tree. And this check valve actually prevents that sap from going back into the tree. I found that they're not very good, though. They actually get pretty gunky and full of bacteria, and just found it really wasn't worth it out here. So placement and number of taps, technically speaking or theoretically speaking, lower is better. And that's only because, remember, the sap is being drawn up into the upper parts of the tree. So by placing your tap a little bit lower, you might be able to collect more of it. Probably ultimately in the difference of, 2 to 4 feet off the ground, and you're dealing with a 60-foot tree or more, or something like that. It probably doesn't really amount to that much of a difference. But in theory, lower is better. The number of taps per tree depends on the diameter at breast height. So at 10 to 20 inches, you can get 1 tap. 20 to 25 inches, you can have up to 2 taps. And then greater than 25 inches, you can have up to 3 taps, but you never want to do more than 3 taps. That crosses over into doing more harm than good. You might not be tapping sustainably at that point. And we also know from research that having more than 3 taps, even on bigger trees, doesn't really end up giving you that much sap. So working with multiple stems in a tree, you can, of course, as I mentioned, treat stems over 10 inches as individual trees. So just because it is all the same tree, doesn't mean you have to treat it as such and only put 1 tap on it. You can actually put multiple if there's stems over 10 inches. Now, in theory, you could take a tree like this where some of the stems are 6, 7, 8 inches. You got some smaller ones in here too. What you could do is tap them, even though they're not quite 10 inches, and you could put 1 here and then switch between them. So you're reducing the number of stems or taps per clump. And then kind of rotating between them until they get bigger than 10 inches. And then you can tap each one of them. And that just gives them enough of a break. You're not putting so much pressure on them while they're that young and small. And some of you may be stuck with slightly younger trees, and this could be a way to still tap some of them while they're growing. And if you're going to come in and say, I plan on coming in and thinning out some of these smaller stems, sometime in the next couple of years, well, I might as well tap it now because it's going to be dead in a couple of years. So you're not really worried too much about those stems. Okay. So retapping. I mentioned that taps start to heal almost as soon as you place them. So a lot of times you will have to retap even within the same season. But every time you retap, every time you tap, you create what's called non-conductive wood. So you might have heard the phrase people heal, trees seal. And that's just referring to the fact that trees don't actually regrow wood that's been harmed or drilled out in this scenario. They actually just seal it off completely, and they no longer allocate resources to it. It prevents fungal growth and bacteria from getting into the living parts of the tree, and that's how they handle wounds. But what that means is that you can never drill in this spot again because you're not going to have fresh sapwood and you won't get any sap flow. So you have to create a pattern that prevents you from tapping in one of those previous tap holes. And what that looks like generally is to, from your previous tap, move 1 to 2 inches to the right or left, and then down 10 to 12 inches. Down or up 10 to 12 inches. And then the next one, you do another couple inches to the right, and then you go up and you create this sort of diamond pattern going around the tree. Ideally, you do that, and by the time you circle back to the place where your original tap was on the outside of the tree, you've created enough, 2 or more inches of new sapwood that would allow you to retap in that same area. Or you can figure out where your pattern was and tap 10 or 12 inches above or below that and restart the pattern. Hard to describe that for you visual learners. That workshop will be a really good way to see that. But again, I mentioned you might tap more than one time in a season. So you really shouldn't, you're not going to get much sap flow beyond 4 to 6 weeks after tapping. And remember, we have a pretty long season. So what I do is I generally end up tapping sometime around Christmas where I'm at. I'm on the water. I'm literally 0 feet elevation. I'm not as prime of a spot as some of the other ones in higher elevations. So I only tap twice in a year, generally starting around Christmas when the freezes are a little more consistent. And then again, once it gets into late January, early February, I'm waiting for another good set of freezes to retap and recreate or create a new fresh tap wound. So how many taps and trees will I need? This is a really common question that I get. And it depends on so many factors. So I really just can't give a good answer, honestly. It depends on tree size, elevation and latitude, as I mentioned, water table and site factors, variability in the season. Every year is different, and how the tree is feeling that day to some extent. There's a lot of variability to consider here. But I put together a really conservative estimate. Say you did 15 taps and you got 10 gallons per tap over the course of a season. And that is a very conservative estimate. Most areas in Western Washington, you're likely to get closer to 20 if you do it right. And we have a decent year. At 1% sugar, which is pretty common sugar percentage, also called bricks for big leaf maple syrup. That means it takes 86 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. With 15 taps, 150 gallons of sap, that means roughly 2 gallons of syrup. So that's a really rough estimate. If we're lucky and you got 20 gallons on 15 taps, then that would give you 4 gallons of syrup over the course of a year, assuming you processed all of it and were relatively efficient about it. You do have some losses in the processing, but I'll talk about that later. So at the commercial scale, it really depends. If you're going to be doing the processing, investing all the equipment, you're going to want a lot more taps. If you were just to sell sap, just raw sap, which may be a possibility down the line, you wouldn't need nearly as many taps. You would just do as many as you want, basically, and as many as to make it appetizing to someone that's a sap buyer. So we'll talk a little bit about the marketing then, and why. When we get to that, we'll talk about maybe, I know this number is really big, 86 gallons of sap, but we'll talk about why that's worth it. So this is a model from the University of Washington, which has really they've led the charge on researching this whole process. They really are kind of pioneering all of that and examining very closely sap production and different factors leading to better sap production and all that kind of stuff around building a commercial industry. So these numbers, although, are based on what we call high power vacuum, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Um, but just consider this the upper limit, like sort of the maximum possible sap production you could get in an area. And it's in liters. 2 liters is roughly 1 gallon. So you can just divide these numbers by 2 to get gallons. And you can see, where I'm at in Lacey, Olympia up here, I'm in the 80 to 120. So that's 40 to 60 gallons per tap per year. Again, upper limit. That's with really good equipment and extremely efficient. I'm much closer to the 20 to 30 range, really, with the equipment that I'm using, which still isn't bad, though. I mean, it's very good. Those are still pretty good numbers. All right, there we go. All right, so sap collection. There's a lot of different ways that you can collect your sap. Well, 3 to be specific. And the sort of early, the point of entry for most folks is to do the traditional buckets and bags, which everybody's, seen images like this on syrup containers. It's the stainless steel bucket hanging off of a tree. It's a very comforting image. But most industrial sap production, like all industrial syrup production, is done using tubing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But buckets and bags are a really great way to get started. There's minimal setup. It's very easy to determine better producing trees. So once you get everything connected on tubing, you really can't tell which trees are better producers and which ones are duds. So buckets and bags allows you to really get to know each tree individually and which ones are your big producers and which ones are going to let you down that might not even be worth tapping anymore. Some cons here, it's lots of physical labor. As you can imagine, you are hauling these buckets and bags, you're emptying up somewhere. It just really depends, the amount of labor on how you're set up. This is where grade comes into play. Whereas with tubing, you want really good grade here. Flat is better, allows you to get your truck in or your side-by-side in so that you can go and collect all that sap. Otherwise, you're hauling it by hand, and that can get to be a lot of work. But generally speaking, buckets and bags, you're doing like somewhere between 10 and 30 taps, I imagine. Not a lot more than that. Maybe, honestly, even less than 10 is pretty common. So one thing, though, buckets and bags need to be cleaned regularly, as does almost everything. We'll talk about bacteria management in a little while. So the next step up would be tubing, specifically gravity-based tubing. So that's using 3/16 or 5/16 diameter plastic tubing. And what it does, it connects and drains them to a central collection tank. The pros here, obviously, there's no carrying required. You're not hauling sap anywhere. Another pro is that you can actually improve sap flow with this tubing, especially 3/16 tubing, which is a little more narrow. What happens is you have decent elevation between the top tap and the bottom tap on one of these tubing lines, say about 30 or 40 feet or so, or honestly anything more than 10 feet, you're going to start to get some natural vacuum. I need to change this. It says natural gravity. It's really natural vacuum. And what that does is as more sap flows out, you're actually pulling more sap. And this will extend your sap run. Whereas buckets and bags, you might get like a 2-day run. With a gravity tubing system and sufficient natural vacuum, you could extend that run out much longer and get more sap. It's comparable to buckets and bags in cost. This is why I kind of tell people to consider the tubing. This 3/16 tubing is like $30 for 800 feet. So it's really, really cheap. There's some tools you have to buy with it and some plastic pieces. So it's certainly, there's other costs to consider. But I think it could be worth it, and it's interesting to try out if nothing else. But it really depends on the tank, because you have to have a central collection tank, depending on what you were planning on doing before with the buckets and bags. If you were going to dump them right into your evaporator or collect them in a tank, or if you're already planning on buying a tank, that's where tubing really becomes kind of an easy next step, because you're not paying much more. Some cons: require setup and maintenance and monitoring. The maintenance and monitoring piece can be particularly cumbersome, especially if you're not getting all the drilling shavings out of the tap hole. That then it can get caught in the tubing, and you have to go in, you have to open it up, and then you have to connect it back together, and that can be kind of cumbersome. And it also requires good soap, and the collection tank has to be at the bottom. So if where you want to process is on the top of the hill, doesn't matter. You're collecting it at the bottom. You got to figure out a way to get the sap from the bottom hill to the top of the hill. All right. Artificial vacuum would be the next step up. And really, this is just another tubing system. But what you're doing is you're actually draining all the smaller tubes into a larger mainline tube, is what you see here. This is a 3/4 inch mainline. And then you're attaching a high power vacuum. This is actually a low power vacuum. This is also helping increase sap flow, but really the purpose of this is to overcome some grade issues where I didn't have enough grade to drain it through gravity alone. But high power vacuums, what those do is they give you maximum vacuum, like 27 inches of mercury, I believe, is what the maximum you can get. And that really extends your sap run. That's what gives you that upper limit of sap production, is attaching one of these to the end of your main line. So it's obviously a greater capital investment. This is something you'd only do if you were doing commercial. You would never do this at the hobby scale. But just something to see. It's really interesting, this technology that they have for this industry now. So dealing with bacteria is really important here in the Pacific Northwest, because again, we have mild temperatures. We always have the thaw. We're waiting for the freeze. That means more bacteria. Warmer temperatures means more bacteria. Bacteria is not generally a problem from a food safety issue. There are some bacteria that are resistant to boiling, but for the most part, what we're worried about with bacteria is actually affecting the flavor of the syrup, because what it does is it converts that sucrose to glucose and fructose, other forms of sugar. That my understanding is that they're more easily burnt, and that affects the flavor. Now, some of that burnt flavor can actually be desirable. It makes a darker syrup. It's really good for cooking and cocktails and things like that. And big leaf maple is an inherently darker syrup with a stronger, bolder flavor. It's very unique. But if you wanted a lighter syrup, you would want to process your sap immediately before that bacteria can do any of that. But I will say, if you let your sap go too far, get too gross, it becomes very acidic and just not very palatable. If you let it go even farther than that, you get what's called ropey syrup, which is just disgusting if you've ever seen it, but it's exactly what it sounds like, and it's not really edible anymore. So there is a fine line to walk there in terms of allowing for some bacteria growth. Generally speaking, if you should be processing it immediately, because even that, you're probably still going to get some bacteria growth in there. So don't let it sit for more than a day or two if temperatures are warm, especially if things are getting into the mid 40s. Anything over fridge temperature, 37, 38 degrees, you're going to get accelerated bacteria growth. Use a stainless steel tank for collection if possible. We've used plastic in the past. It's not great. If you can clean it, if you have access, wherever your collection tank is, to be able to clean it very frequently, then that's an option. But otherwise, stainless steel is it's definitely the best option for bacteria management. Keep your collection tanks out of the sun. Clean your buckets, bags, and tanks regularly. Avoid fragrant cleaners. You don't want to use fragrant cleaners. All of that flavor will get concentrated in the boil. Anything exposed to your sap is going to get concentrated, right? So you won't want your sap tasting like lemon Lysol. Instead, you're going to use like some hydrogen peroxide. There are certain like brewers sanitizers that work pretty well. I use Star San. If there's any brewers in the crowd tonight, that seems to be a pretty good one. It's phosphoric acid based and doesn't really have a strong flavor. And then with tubing systems, you want to avoid sags where sap collects and stays, and then flush your tubing regularly between sap flows. All right, so processing. And this is big leaf maple syrup here on the right. You can tell it's much darker. I've seen it get lighter than this for sure. This is probably dark because I let it sit too long. But again, big leaf maple is an inherently darker syrup. So sugar content. As soon as you have your sap collected, you are going to want to try to figure out the sap content or the sugar content of your sap. You can go without that, but you're kind of operating in the dark a little bit. So generally speaking, big leaf maple sap is between 0.7 and 1.5% sugar. It's also called Brix. The Jones rule of 86 says that you divide 86 by Brix, and that gives you the number of gallons needed. So if you have 1.2% sap, that's going to mean you need 72 gallons to make 1 gallon of syrup. That doesn't include your losses. You do have sugar losses just in the process. So you might get 2/3 of that or 3/4 of that in the end. Syrup is syrup at 66.7% Brix. That's what the people in Vermont will tell you. But there's generally accepted a range between, I think, 66.5 and around 69. Anything more than that, you're considered burning it and you're going to get more crystallization. Anything less than that, you might have too high of an active water content and you can get bacteria growth in there. Brix can be tested in sap, can be tested with a field refractometer like this. It's like $20. It goes up to 10% Brix. So you can even test some concentrated sap in there. Digital refractometer like this is about $100. And that will test all the way up to your syrup levels as well. Some people just use a candy thermometer when they're boiling, and you probably will do that as an entry-level hobbyist. Syrup boils at 219. That's 7 degrees above the boiling temperature of water. So as you're boiling your sap, you're looking at your thermometer. As it gets closer and closer to 219, you're getting close to syrup. So you do this using evaporators. Generally speaking, I try to get people to avoid cooking it in their kitchen, mostly because most of the people I know that have done this in their kitchen say they're never going to do it again. And that's good reason. It's not a very efficient boil. You're putting a lot of moisture into your house. I mean, there's just so much steam, which that can be problematic. It can lead to mold issues. I've even heard back east where houses are much older, where the beams collect too much moisture and they actually have collapsed because of all of that steam inside the house. So ideally, you're not doing this inside the house. You're at least going out and doing a backwoods evaporator like what I have here. This is just a cinder block evaporator, as you can see. The materials here are really not much, maybe about $100 all told. And with some pans in there, you can boil just fine. It's not going to be terribly efficient compared to some of the upper scale technology that I'll talk about, but it's going to be better than your kitchen stove for sure. With these, and evaporators are generally rated in efficiency based off of how many gallons of water they can boil off in an hour, not how many gallons of syrup they can produce an hour. So gallons of water being boiled off an hour. And with these, I would expect generally around 3 to 10 gallons per hour, depending on different tricks you can do to make it more efficient, which is good for the hobbyist, 0 to 50 taps. And that's the one, that's the homemade evaporator in action there. And more recently, I've upgraded to what we call a hobby evaporator. This is one that I purchased from a distributor out east, a Canadian company. And it's much better. It can get 10 to 30 gallons per hour. All told in here, it's about 20 to 30 gallons I can keep in here because you want to keep it about 2 inches for an efficient boil. And I can get that boiling in about 10 minutes with this. It's wood fired. It's very good. I'm very happy with it, but it did cost about $3,000. So, this is probably not something you're going to do right away. Good for an advanced hobbyist, 50 to 200 taps, somebody that's, kind of ready to scale up a little bit, but not quite commercial scale. And then, of course, you have the big industrial professional evaporators. These things are finely tuned. This is something that no hobbyist would ever dream of purchasing, or maybe dream of it, but wouldn't do it, of course. Certainly this is for commercial production, but it's cool to see. These are incredibly efficient machines, and we're talking really something like this is way more than 10,000. I mean, some of these machines can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, especially when you add on all these additional equipment that are part of the process. So a lot of what makes your evaporator efficient is the pan. The evaporator itself, the stove part, it can be made more efficient. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but the pan is really where you start. So a lot of people start with just these stainless steel restaurant pans. It's a really cheap option. Again, if you're trying to stick to under $100, that's what I would go with. It's not going to be as efficient as some of the other stuff, but it's going to get you where you need to go. If you wanted to upgrade from there, you could purchase a divided pan. That's what I did for my homemade evaporator. It was another like $250, maybe 300. I got it refurbished. This is a lower quality pan, but it did increase my efficiency. I went from 3 gallons an hour to 7 or 8 gallons an hour. And so what happens here is you pour fresh sap on this side, and you see these slats that are dividing this. What happens is you create a sugar gradient. So fresh sap comes in here. As it boils, it concentrates and moves down here. And here you have the most concentrated stuff. And over here, you have the least concentrated stuff. It creates a more efficient boil. So that's, a really great way to increase your efficiency. Also, cleaning these things regularly is a great way to make sure that they are staying efficient. Firewood is the best fuel at hobby scale. Most forest owners have lots of firewood around. Doing this on a gas stove is not going to be efficient if you are, especially starting from raw sap and you're not using a reverse osmosis, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Really, I wouldn't really recommend using gas. You're going to use a lot of it. At that point, firewood's much better, much cheaper. So tips for increasing efficiency: warming your sap before entering, if possible. They have warming pans actually that kind of sit on this back half, and then you pour the sap in here, and then you let it trickle in into the lower pan, and doing that, the sap is entering almost at boiling, and so you get it much more efficient that way. Insulating the stove with ceramic wool and fire brick can certainly help. Increasing the surface area exposed to heat. So this is my pan in action, but what I really want to show you is this. It has what's called a drop flue. So all of these lines, these runs, are full of sap when it's boiling. And this greatly increases the surface area exposed to the fire. And that's what makes me able to get this up to a boil so quickly. So these drop flues are incredibly efficient. And then there's stuff like reverse osmosis machines, which are really interesting. What you're doing here is, a lot of people, I'm sure, are familiar with the process of reverse osmosis. Most people use it to purify water and then drink the water. What we're doing is we're drawing out the purified water and we're keeping the concentrated sugar. So every time you run sap through, you go from 1% to 2%, 2% to 4%, and then you keep going depending on the grade of your equipment here. So usually, this is reserved for commercial producers or maybe advanced hobbyists. In fact, you just really can't be a commercial producer without this, because it's a massive time and energy savings. You are removing roughly 90% of the water by bringing it up to 8% sugar before boiling it. So I mean, that's a lot of water that you're getting rid of without having to boil. So, I mean, it's really quite impressive how much time and energy these things save. But as I said, it's usually for commercial producers, but recently there is a company that started making them in buckets, and they're relatively cheap. Certainly more approachable for a hobbyist, somebody that's not really interested in going as hard as some of these industrial equipment. And these move kind of slow, but they will get your sap up to 4%, which is removing a lot of the water. And so I'd encourage people to look them up. So finishing, filtering, and storing. So typically sap, we'll talk about finishing first, is drawn off the evaporator at 30 to 50 Brix, or 30 to 50%. and then finished on controlled heat. That just allows you to get closer and closer to the 66 to 69 mark without going over. You want to keep a close eye, use a low heat as it gets closer. Watch out for foam at this stage, especially if you get enough foam buildup, it'll just boil completely over your pan and cause a huge mess. I've done that in the kitchen for sure. And so when I mean a controlled heat, this is where you might bring in your gas. Use like a camp stove or something like that, and it's just a little more controlled, more refined. I'll also add that if you have a really good reverse osmosis like the industrial folks do, they do use gas, but it's only because they've removed a lot of that water. So remember that. So not everyone knows this, but when you finish boiling and you're up to your syrup level, you actually have to filter it because you get a lot of what's called sugar sand. That's what this is right here. And it's minerals that have bound to sugar during the boiling process. So you have to filter that out. You could use coffee filters. I've tried that. It's not very efficient. And I really recommend these cone filters for hobbyists. It's like $30. They're reusable. They're way more efficient than coffee filters. So it's really not a huge investment. Beyond that, they have things like a filter press, which I'll show here. This is hooked up to a shop vac, right? So you're getting that vacuum. It's sucking the syrup through several filters, and then this is heated, so it's keeping it hot because you want to filter it while it's hot. It'll be much easier to filter, and then you're able to bottle it right out of the spout here. So that's a cool piece of equipment. But I really like these cone filters for the hobby scale. And then that sugar sand itself could actually be its own product. I've actually used it to infuse things like whiskey. It's very, very good. One thing to keep in mind is that one test we've done multiple. I have not. I actually was Oregon State University. Some folks down there did some testing on sugar sands and syrup just to look at the mineral content and stuff like that. And one of their tests actually showed that the sugar sands had a high level of heavy metals, and I forget which one it was specifically. So if your trees are growing on a site that might be near an old dump or a spill of some kind, some of that can end up possibly in the sugar sand. It doesn't end up in the syrup, it seems, but it could end up in the sugar sand. So it's just something to keep in mind. If you don't have any suspicion of any sort of spills or anything like that, then you probably don't have anything to worry about. In terms of storing, fridge can last for a year. If you're only making like a quart or something like that, it's not going to last a year anyway. So I just say put it in the fridge. Canning and bottling can last several years. Glass is best for that. And what I generally do is a standard process is to warm it back up to 190 degrees after you're done filtering. And then pour it into sterilized jars, and then invert those jars, put them upside down for a few minutes so that it sterilizes the top. And then at that point, you should be able to get a good seal if you're using fresh lids. So that's the standard process for canning. Generally speaking, I really just tend to freeze it at this point. So I know that if I didn't get quite up to 66% and the active water content is still kind of high in there, that I'm not going to get any bacteria growth. And I tend to have the freezer space, so it's not a huge deal. All right, maple products and recipes. So there is let's see what time it is. Oh, I think I need to move a little bit quicker. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with maple. You don't have to do just syrup. You could go boil it further and get sugar. Some people drink the sap slightly concentrated, maybe up to 10%. I'm currently making maple wine right now. Lots of different stuff. Maple candies are delicious. Infused syrups with coffee and cinnamon and things like that. So I really encourage people to get creative beyond, just the syrup itself. In terms of Sugarbush management, not a lot to talk about here, mostly because it overlaps so well with good forest health management. Basically, what you want here is healthy, vigorous trees, putting on lots of diameter growth. More diameter growth means more sapwood to tap. Avoid spreading heart rot and butt rots by pruning only when the trees are dormant. That's between October and March generally. Bigger trees are better up to a point. Remember what I said about some of the big monster old growth trees. Multi-stem trees tend to be better, and you can actually manage for those. You can coppice trees and then thin those out and select for multi-stem trees. So the market is truly untapped if you're considering this at the commercial scale. There's only one commercial producer in Washington right now. I think there's a few on the way, though, based on some of the recent efforts. Right now, the syrup's going for about $4 an ounce, which is about $400 to $500 a gallon. No one's buying a gallon. Everyone's buying it kind of in the small doses. But that's where this number is really makes up for how much sap you need to make this. It's a very unique product. It's high value product. It's very it's desirable for cooks and bartenders, and there's really, from what I understand, a lot of market left to be tapped in Seattle and Portland and even beyond. And there could be opportunities to sell sap. Like I can't imagine a lot of people wanting to make the huge investments into the industrial, big scale commercial processing equipment. But starting out by selling sap could be a great way. And I'm really hoping down the line we get there. It's going to take some time to create a market for sap, but I do think it's a possibility. It's really common back east. But other than that, again, this is more about the hobby scale, and I don't want to undersell the hobbyists. Getting out there, it fosters a connection to the forest, creates good learning opportunities, great way to get kids out there. This is a lot of fun for kids, get them to build connections with nature, learn about nature, connect with their family forest, or consider a career in forestry or a related profession. Gets people out in the woods, encourages active management, gets your eyes on the woods, opportunity to stay active during the winter months. And of course, hobbyists still contribute a lot to the market in terms of equipment sales and public awareness and festivals and agritourism, things like that. So as I mentioned, there's some things to look out for. Grace mentioned I'm going to be doing a workshop down here in Olympia on September 9th. And in the Northwest region, you guys are going to have a companion workshop. The date and location to be determined. I imagine a lot of you folks are from the Northwest region, so it may make sense for y'all to wait for that one. And I'm sure it'll be equally as good. So another great program coming out is the what we're calling the Sap Suckers program. Very proud of that name. It's a community science effort. And what this means is people that are out there doing this at a hobby scale can send in their data and contribute to a region-wide collection of data that can help us learn more about what leads to better sap production and sap quality and that kind of thing. The University of Washington is leading up a community sugaring initiative, and that includes a mobile evaporator. So they're going to go park that evaporator out somewhere and allow people to come, bring their sap, have it processed, and take home the syrup. And some of you may have actually joined for the last Bigleaf Maple Syrup Festival. It was the first ever in Washington. That was up in Eatonville at the UW Pack Forest last May. So we'll be doing that again in the spring of 23. And I'm not sure if it will be in May again or if it'll be earlier, but just keep your eyes peeled for that. That was a lot of fun. Okay, I got some time for questions, I believe.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick. And you do have a few questions. First question, is there a way to identify young, smaller maples in the fall or winter to transplant them?
Young, smaller maples in fall or winter to transplant them. Yeah, I mean, winter ID, whether small or big, is going to be about the same. The only difference would be the bark, obviously, if you're dealing with 1 to 2 year old seedlings. But you're going to be looking for that opposite arrangement of buds. And, it can be a little difficult, right, if you're mistaking it for some of the other oppositely arranged species like dogwood or ash. But if you look at your site, and if you look at the bud type, so if you just go online and look at, bud pictures of bigleaf maple and really train your eyes on that, then you can really get good at winter ID, and that would give you a good shot.
Very cool. Next question, can you get a good natural vacuum using just one tap and tube if it goes down a slope quite a ways?
Yeah, absolutely. The number of taps, yeah, well, the number of taps, I shouldn't say that. The number of taps may contribute to that vacuum, but really it's the drop ultimately. So, yeah, absolutely. And in theory, you may even get a little bit of vacuum just by dropping your tube 4 feet down to a bucket. So that is possible. But more is better. I think if you get 30 feet of elevation, that's about the maximum natural vacuum you can achieve. But don't quote me on that. Anyway, the answer is yes.
Great. Can you please provide a diagram for your homemade evaporator? Do you have any
um,
resources like that?
I don't have any resources like that. What I would tell you is that I saw it on YouTube. So if you just Google cinder block evaporator on YouTube, you will be able to find multiple and probably some better ones, frankly. But there wasn't really much to it. Honestly, it was just you kind of stacked them up like Legos so that they were looked like the shape of a stove. But again, there's better ones. And if you mortar them together, they'll be more efficient and all kinds of stuff like that.
Great. Will a propane burner outside, oops, sorry, I lost it. Will a propane burner outside, like for dipping ducks, I don't know what that means, work
Hmm.
for boiling at hobby level?
I mean, it certainly could. Again, if you're boiling raw sap that hasn't gone through reverse osmosis, so it's 1% sap on gas, you're going to go through a lot of gas. But it's been done certainly, and a lot of people do it. That's how they get started. So if you're willing to do that, that's it's way better than your kitchen still because you're not getting again all that steam and stuff in your house. And so I would certainly recommend that over your kitchen. It's just going to take a little while.
Do you ever need to filter the same batch more than once?
No, no, I haven't yet. That doesn't mean I won't. But I think generally speaking, you get everything you can in the first pass.
Nice. Do you have info on tapping on public lands? Is it possible with permits? Could you trust your equipment to be alone? I'm not sure about the last part of that question, but
Yeah. So that is being looked into right now, actually. Maybe getting a permit from the DNR or I think so far it's been the DNR. I haven't heard of anyone doing this on Forest Service lands, maybe back east. But that could be possible, certainly. It's just so early. Most people are still finding out that you can even do this with big leaf maple. Um, can you trust your equipment to be alone? That's a tricky question. More often than not, the answer is no. But if it's just plastic tubing, then yeah, probably I imagine they're not going to be tearing that up. But I couldn't guarantee that, obviously. But if you're putting, you know, if you're putting your evaporator out there and stuff and high dollar equipment, then I would imagine it's going to get swiped up.
any updates on what other trees should be avoided in the sugar bush for flavor reasons, like cedar?
So I've heard about this. Some people believe that if a cedar is next to a maple, then it could affect the flavor. Um, and I really can't speak to that. Some of the hobbyists I know that have been doing this for, decades with buckets and bags, so they really know their individual trees. I have not told me that they've experienced that. Those would be the people that I would ask. Um, and I'm of course working on a tubing system, so I can't tell which sap came from what tree anymore. But we don't have any reason to believe that's true, but that doesn't mean it isn't. Um, but generally speaking, I'm not worrying about what other trees are associated with my sugar bush. You just want as much maple as you can.
Cool. Okay, we have two questions that are very similar, so I'll just combine them. What is the maximum taps on 3/16 line with gravity natural vacuum? And at what point do you need to go to a bigger line?
That's a good question. Generally speaking, you don't want more than 30 taps on a single line with gravity. Or with natural gravity vacuum. And anything beyond that, you just got to do another line, basically. And that's where connecting mainline out there can make it easier to connect those different lines. You don't necessarily want to mix 3/16 and 5/16 if that's what you meant by bigger line. You want to stick to the same tubing. 3/16 again is better for natural gravity. If you're doing a high power vacuum, that's when you switch to 5/16. But yeah, 30 taps roughly on a line. Anything more than that, you just got to do another line.
Great. Well, we don't have any more questions and we're just about at time, so that's perfect. If any questions come up, feel free to reach out to Patrick or myself via email. And I will also be sending out the recording of this via email, and I'll get that out tomorrow. Thank you so much, Patrick, for a great presentation. And thanks to everybody who was able to join us tonight.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
All right. Have a good night.